In the year 1066, three kings would clash for the throne of England, and the fate of nations would pivot on steel and blood. But before the arrows darkened the sky at Hastings, before William of Normandy earned his epithet, the Conqueror, another warrior would make his final, fatal bid for glory. His name was Harald Sigurdsson, called Hardrada, Hard Ruler, and he was the last true Viking to shake the pillars of Europe. This is not a tale of courtly love or chivalric tournaments. This is the saga of a man who fought in 3 empires, commanded the Byzantine emperor's elite guard, claimed a northern throne through force and cunning, and died as he had lived, with sword in hand and defiance on his lips. Harald Hardrada stood at the twilight of an age, when the old gods still whispered in the minds of Norsemen and the new order of feudal Christendom spread across the continent like morning frost. His story begins not in the palaces of Constantinople or the halls of Norway, but in the frozen wastes of exile, where a 15-year-old prince learned that survival demanded more than noble blood. It demanded the ruthlessness of a wolf and the vision of an eagle. The Battle of Stiklestad ended in screaming chaos, and the metallic stench of opened bodies steaming in the Norwegian summer air. Harald Sigurdsson, barely 15 years old, felt the arrow punch through his shoulder with the sound like a butcher's cleaver striking meat. Pain exploded white-hot across his vision, but training kept him upright, kept his shield raised against the next blow. "Fall back!" someone roared. Perhaps his half-brother, King Olaf, perhaps one of the housecarls who still fought in the shield wall. But the king's forces were breaking, scattering like chaff before the combined armies of the Norwegian nobles who had rejected Olaf's stern Christian rule and his attempts to crush the old ways. Harald stumbled through the carnage, his youth and minor wounds saving him from the focused brutality reserved for recognized warriors. Bodies lay everywhere, friends and enemies alike, their blood soaking into the rich earth. The date was July 29th, 1030, and though Harald did not yet know it, this moment would forge the foundation of everything he would become. A housecarl named Ragnvald found him half-conscious behind a fallen horse, grabbed him by his good arm, and dragged him into the trees. "The king?" Harald gasped, already knowing the answer from the older man's expression. "Dead. Olaf Haraldsson is fallen." Ragnvald's weathered face showed no emotion, but his hands shook as he cut away Harald's blood-soaked tunic to examine the wound. "You must live, boy. You're the last of your line with any claim worth mentioning." The irony was bitter. Harald had come to this battle eager to prove himself, to stand beside his half-brother in the shield wall like a true warrior. Instead, he would slink away in defeat, branded as one of the losing side, marked for execution if the victorious nobles caught him. They fled east through the forests, moving at night, surviving on stolen food and the charity of farmers who still secretly honored the memory of King Olaf. The wound in Harald's shoulder festered and burned, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. With each painful step, his innocence died a little more. The journey to the Rus lands took months, a blur of suffering that Harald would remember only in fragments. The fever dreams where his brother's corpse spoke prophecies, the kindness of a Swedish widow who hid them for a week. The moment he looked back across a frozen lake and knew he would never see Norway as a boy again. In Kiev, they found sanctuary at the court of Yaroslav the Wise, Grand Prince of Kiev. Yaroslav was married to Ingigerd, daughter of the Swedish king, and Norse culture ran strong in the Rus veins. Harald and his handful of surviving companions were received with cautious honor, useful pieces in the endless chess game of Eastern European politics. "You have the bearing of a warrior," Yaroslav observed, during their first formal audience, studying Harald with eyes that missed nothing. "But you're still more boy than man. What can you offer my court?" Harold's shoulder still ached where the arrow had pierced him. The scar tissue pulled tight whenever he moved, a permanent reminder of failure. But he met the Grand Prince's gaze without flinching. "I can offer you loyalty, Lord, and I can offer you this promise. I learn quickly, I fight hard, and I never forget those who help me, or those who harm you, especially those who harm me." Yaroslav's beard twitched with what might have been amusement. "You'll do, I think. We'll see if you survive what I have in mind." Harold spent 3 years in Kiev, and they transformed him utterly. Yaroslav put him to work almost immediately, giving him a command of a small force tasked with patrolling the borderlands against Pechenic warbands. It was brutal, unglamorous work, exactly what Harold needed. His first independent command came in the winter of 1031. A Pechenic warband, perhaps 300 strong, had been raiding outlying settlements. Harold tracked them with 60 men, found them camped in a river valley, and attacked just before dawn. The Vikings had always preferred shock and speed over prolonged combat. Harold led the charge himself, his men erupting from the tree line like wolves. The Pechenics had barely had time to grab their weapons before Harold's sword, a beautiful pattern-welded blade Yaroslav had gifted him, was cutting through the first defender's collarbone. What followed was not battle, but butchery. Harold had learned from Stiklestad that hesitation meant death. He fought with controlled fury, his blade finding gaps in armor, his shield breaking noses and teeth. When a Pechenic champion challenged him to single combat, Harold feinted high and opened his man's belly low, then moved on without ceremony. They killed or captured every raider. Harold ordered the survivors impaled on the road as a warning, then burned the camp and rode back to Kiev with Pechenic horses and stolen gold. Yaroslav received the tribute with an approving nod. "You've lost the last softness," Yaroslav observed. "Good. Softness gets men killed." Harold's reputation grew with each campaign. He fought in Poland in the endless succession wars that plagued the Rus lands. Anywhere Yaroslav needed a commander who would do what was necessary. He learned to speak Greek, to navigate court politics, to recognize the difference between an enemy who could be bought and one who could only be killed. But Kiev was never going to be enough. Harold's dreams still echoed with the screams at Stiklestad, still saw his brother's banner falling in the summer dust. He was 19 years old, already a proven warrior, and Norway felt further away than ever. "I need to make my fortune," he told Yaroslav in the spring of 1034. "I need to become someone kings fear, someone who can command armies and reshape kingdoms." Yaroslav studied him across a table laden with maps of the known world. "Constantinople," he said finally. "The Varangian Guard. They're always looking for Norsemen who can fight, and the Byzantine emperor pays in gold that would make you weep. Serve him well. Learn everything you can about how empires actually work, and maybe you'll go home ready to take what's yours." The journey south was almost leisurely compared to Harold's desperate flight from Norway. He traveled with a company of volunteers, mostly younger sons and landless warriors looking for the same thing he was, glory and gold. They took ship from Kiev, sailing down the Dnieper through lands that grew steadily warmer and stranger. Constantinople struck Harold like a physical blow when they first caught sight of it from the deck. He had thought Kiev was a great city, had marveled at its churches and markets, but the Byzantine capital dwarfed it utterly. The wall stretched forever. The great dome of Hagia Sophia dominated the skyline like a second sun. And the sheer wealth visible, even from the harbor, made his Rus earnings seem like a peasant's copper. "The center of the world," said Ulf, one of Harold's companions, his voice hushed with something like religious awe. "The center of their world," Harold corrected, but his pulse quickened nonetheless. This was power, on a scale he had barely imagined, power he intended to understand and perhaps someday wield. The Varangian Guard had been established nearly 50 years earlier, after Norse warriors had proven their worth to Byzantine emperors as loyal, effective fighters who owed no allegiance to local factions. They served as the emperor's personal bodyguard, shock troops in critical battles and end forces when delicate political situations required foreign hands. The Guard's commander,
A gray-bearded Swede named Håkon examined Harald and his companions with an assessing eye like a horse trader. "You're younger than most recruits," he said bluntly. "What makes you think you can handle the guard?" Harald drew his sword in one smooth motion, the blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. It was his finest possession, the pattern-welded steel, a marvel of Norwegian craftsmanship, the hilt wrapped and wired to prevent slipping. He held it perfectly still in an extended guard position, muscles barely straining despite the uncomfortable angle. "I've killed more men than I can count," Harald said quietly. "I've led warriors in battle, and I've never run from a fight I can win. Give me a chance to prove it." Håkon's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. "One chance. Survive training, survive your first campaign, and we'll see if you have what it takes." Harald lowered his blade and sheathed it with the same fluid grace. "I'll survive," he said. "I always do."
The Varangian Guard barracks occupied a fortified compound near the Great Palace, a small city within the city where nearly 1,000 warriors from all corners of the north lived, trained, and waited for the call to battle. Harald was assigned to a 10-man unit commanded by a Norwegian named Hallvard, who had served the emperor for 12 years. "The Byzantines think we're barbarians," Hallvard explained during Harald's first night, his Greek fluent but accented. "They're not entirely wrong, but they also know we're the only troops who won't stab the emperor for a bag of gold and a promise of land. That makes us valuable. That makes us rich." The training regime was punishing but not impossible for someone of Harald's experience. What challenged him more was learning the Byzantine way of war. Disciplined formations, coordinated tactics with cavalry and archers, siegecraft more sophisticated than anything he'd seen in the north. The Byzantines fought like chess players, maneuvering for advantage, while Harald had been raised on the Viking tradition of shock and slaughter. "It's not better or worse," Hallvard told him after Harald expressed frustration with the endless drills. "It's different. Learn it all. A wise warrior has many tools." Harald's first real test came 3 months after his arrival. The Emperor Michael IV, called the Paphlagonian, was leading a campaign to reclaim Sicily from Arab control. The Varangian Guard would form the vanguard for the assault on Syracuse. The fleet that carried them south was the largest Harald had ever seen, over 200 ships, their sails bright with imperial banners, their decks crowded with armored warriors. Harald stood at the rail as Constantinople faded behind them, feeling something shift in his chest. This was no border raid, no petty feud between Rus princes. This was imperial warfare. Syracuse clung to its rocky promontory like a defiant castle, its walls ancient but well-maintained, its harbor protected by a massive chain that could be raised to prevent enemy vessels from entering. The Arab garrison, perhaps 5,000 strong, had no intention of surrendering. The assault began at dawn. Byzantine engineers had constructed siege towers on specially designed ships, and these now approached the harbor walls under a hail of arrows and stones. The Varangians would be first through any breach. It was their privilege and their burden. Harald checked his armor one final time. Mail shirt newly oiled, shield reinforced with iron bands, his sword sharp enough to shave with. Around him, the other guards made similar preparations, their faces set in the peculiar calm of veterans before combat. "Stay close to me," Hallvard commanded as the ships ground against the harbor walls. "Don't be a hero. Just kill anyone who gets in your way and keep moving forward." The boarding ramps crashed down, and the Varangians surged forward with a roar that echoed off the stone. Harald found himself swept up in the rush, his boots pounding on wood and then stone, his shield up as arrows whined past his head. The first Arab soldier he met was young, probably younger than Harald himself, armed with a curved sword and a desperate courage. Their blades met with a bell-like clang. Harald smashed his shield forward, staggering the man, then drove his sword point into the gap between helmet and mail coif. The soldier dropped, and Harald was already moving, following Hallvard's broad back deeper into the fighting. The battle for the walls lasted for 6 hours. The Arabs fought with fanatic determination, using every advantage the terrain offered. But Byzantine discipline and Varangian ferocity eventually told. When the imperial banner rose above the main gate, the defenders' resistance crumbled into a desperate retreat toward the inner citadel. Harald found himself in a narrow street, blood slicking the stones, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A group of Arab warriors had barricaded themselves in a house and were raining missiles down on the advancing Byzantines. Hallvard cursed and looked around for engineers to bring up a ram. "Let me try something," Harald said. He started the building. 3 stories, flat roof, wooden balconies on the upper floors. The house beside it was abandoned and burning, flames licking up its walls. Harald grabbed a broken spear shaft, wrapped cloth around one end, and lit it from the burning building. "What are you—" Harald began, but Harald was already moving. He used his shield to protect himself from thrown stones, got close enough to the barricaded house, and hurled the improvised torch onto the wooden balcony. The flames caught immediately, feeding on dry timber. Within minutes, the defenders were pouring out the front entrance, coughing and panicked. The Varangians cut them down efficiently. Hallvard clapped Harald on the shoulder, his weathered face split by a fierce grin. "Not bad, boy. Not bad at all." Syracuse fell after a 3-week siege, and the Varangians were rewarded with a substantial share of the plunder. Harald found himself suddenly wealthy by the standards of common warriors. His share included gold coin, silk, and the magnificent Damascus steel dagger that he would carry for the rest of his life. But the real reward was what he learned. As the Byzantines consolidated their control of the city, Harald watched how they did it, installing loyal governors, offering generous terms to those who submitted peacefully, executing the leaders of the resistance publicly and brutally. It was statecraft performed with surgical precision. "The empire has been doing this for 1,000 years, observed Hallvard one evening as they sat in a commandeered villa, drinking wine that cost more than most warriors made in a month. "Pay attention to everything. You came here to make your fortune, but the real treasure is what you're learning about power." Over the next 4 years, Harald became one of the most respected warriors in the Varangian Guard. He fought in North Africa against the Saracens, in Armenia against rebel princes, and in a dozen smaller actions that kept the empire's borders secure. He learned Arabic and improved his Greek until he could negotiate with captured officers and understand the nuances of Byzantine court politics. His reputation for tactical creativity grew. In one battle against Bedouin raiders, he ordered his men to dismount and fight on foot in a tight formation, using the discipline the Byzantines had taught them to turn the nomads' mobility advantage into a fatal weakness. In another, he personally led a night raid that captured an enemy baggage train and forced a besieging army to withdraw for lack of supplies. By 1038, Harald was wealthy enough to maintain his own household within the barracks, rich enough that Byzantine nobles invited him to their homes, confident enough to offer advice to commanders who had been fighting wars when he was still in cradle clothes. But success bred complications. The Byzantine court was a nest of vipers, where alliances shifted like sand, and today's favorite could be tomorrow's exile or corpse. Harald learned this lesson when he became entangled in a scheme that would have been forgotten to history if not for its spectacular failure. Empress Zoe, then in her 60s and on her 3rd husband, took an interest in the tall Norwegian warrior who commanded such loyalty from his men. Harald was summoned to attend her at private audiences where she would question him about the North, about his ambitions, about his views on loyalty and power. "The emperor is weak," she said during one such meeting, her aged but still beautiful face showing no concern that she might be overheard. "He shakes with palsy, he cannot make decisions, and the empire suffers for it. We need strength. We need warriors who understand the necessity of bold action." Harald understood immediately what she was suggesting, or at least what she wanted him to think she was suggesting. A coup against Michael IV, with Harald and the Varangian Guard providing the muscle, and afterward, perhaps a grateful empress might shower even greater rewards on her supporters. "I am loyal to the emperor," Harald said carefully. "The guard does not involve itself in the internal politics of the empire." Loyalty is a virtue, but sometimes the highest loyalty is to the empire itself, not to the man wearing the crown. Harald extricated himself from the meeting and went directly to Hakon, who listened to his report with a growing scowl. "The Empress is testing you," the guard commander said, "probably testing all of us, seeing if we can be turned. The moment we take sides in their palace games, we just become another faction, and then we lose everything that makes us valuable. So we do nothing."
We do our duty. We protect whoever wears the crown. And we remember that empresses who plot against their husbands have very short memories when it comes to rewarding those who helped them. The crisis passed when Michael IV died of natural causes a few months later. Zoe married yet again, and the political landscape shifted once more. Harald had learned a crucial lesson. In the Byzantine Empire, everyone was playing a game more complex than chess, and the only way to win was not to play at all, or at least not to be seen playing. In 1040, Harald's career reached new heights when he was placed in command of a Varangian detachment assigned to suppress a rebellion in Bulgaria. Peter Delian, claiming descent from the Bulgarian royal line, had raised an army and was threatening to break away several provinces from imperial control. This was Harald's first truly independent command since joining the Guard, and he approached it with characteristic intensity. He led 500 Varangians and twice that number of Byzantine infantry into the Bulgarian highlands, tasked with bringing Delian to heel. The campaign taught Harald the difficulties of counterinsurgency warfare. The Delian's forces refused to meet him in open battle, instead melting into the mountains and striking at Byzantine supply lines. Harald responded with a strategy he would later use to great effect in his own wars. He bypassed Delian's forces entirely and began systematically conquering the villages that supported the rebellion. "If you cut off the roots, the tree dies," he explained to his skeptical Byzantine colleagues. "Delian's army needs food, shelter, recruits. Take those away and he becomes irrelevant." It was brutal work. Harald was ruthless with communities that resisted, offering generous terms to those who submitted immediately, but showing no mercy to those who fought. Slowly, methodically, he strangled the rebellion's support base. The final confrontation came when Delian, desperate and running out of options, led a reckless assault on Harald's fortified camp. The Varangians met the attack with their usual ferocity, but it was Harald's tactical arrangement. Infantry in the center, Varangian heavy troops on the wings, cavalry hidden in a nearby ravine that turned the battle into a massacre. Delian himself fell in the fighting, his head presented to Harald by a young Varangian who had struck the killing blow. Harald studied the rebel leader's dead face, noting the resemblance to the old Bulgarian royal family, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "Send it to Constantinople," he ordered. "Let the emperor know his problem is solved." The victory made Harald famous throughout the empire. Emperor Michael V, the new ruler, received him personally and awarded him the title of Mangalavites, a high military rank usually reserved for Byzantine nobles. More importantly, Harald's share of the Bulgarian campaign's plunder made him spectacularly wealthy. He was 25 years old, commander of the Varangian Guard in all but name, rich beyond the dreams of most warriors, and increasingly certain that it was time to leave.
By 1042, Harald's personal fortune exceeded that of many Byzantine nobles. He had invested wisely, using the financial acumen he'd learned from watching the empire's merchants. He owned ships, had interests in trading ventures that stretched from the Black Sea to the Atlantic, and maintained a network of contacts throughout the known world. But wealth without purpose was just a pretty cage. Harald sat in his quarters one evening, surrounded by the trappings of success, silk cushions, fine wine, the best armor money could buy, and felt the old hunger gnawing at him. 12 years had passed since Stiklestad.
The wound in his shoulder had long since healed, but the memory of defeat still burned. "You're thinking about going home," Hallvard said. The old warrior had become something like a father to Harald, as close as Harald let anyone get to his guarded heart. "Norway has been without a strong king for too long. My nephew Magnus rules, but he's young, and the throne isn't secure. There are always pretenders, always nobles looking to carve out their own kingdoms." "Magnus is your brother's son. You'd challenge your own nephew?" Harald's smile was sharp. "I'd serve him, for a time, until I understand the situation. And then—" he shrugged. "Then we'll see what opportunities present themselves." Hallvard shook his head, but didn't argue. He knew Harald enough to recognize when the younger man had made a decision. "You'll need to be careful. Leaving the guard isn't like resigning from a job. You know things, you have influence, and the new emperor is paranoid about anyone who might pose a threat. Which is why I'll need to be clever about it." Emperor Michael V, called the Caulker for his father's profession, was proving to be one of the worst rulers in Byzantine history. Paranoid, cruel, and stupid in equal measure, he had alienated the Varangian Guard by attempting to replace them with his own loyalists. When he made the fatal mistake of trying to exile Empress Zoe, who remained popular with the people, Constantinople erupted in revolt. Harald saw his opportunity. The Varangian Guard traditionally remained neutral in Byzantine succession crises, but Harald convinced enough of his fellow commanders that Michael V represented a unique threat to their position. When the mob stormed the Great Palace, the Guard stood aside, and when Michael fled to a monastery seeking sanctuary, it was Varangians who dragged him out and delivered him to the new rulers. In the chaos that followed Michael's blinding in exile, Harald quietly gathered his fortune. Gold, jewelry, trade goods, anything portable and valuable, and prepared to vanish. He couldn't simply leave. The new regime would want him to stay, and a warrior of his prominence couldn't disappear without questions being asked. So, Harald staged a theft from the imperial treasury. It was audacious to the point of madness. Harald used his access as a guard commander to enter the treasury, replaced a portion of the contents with lead weights painted gold, and smuggled the real gold out over several nights. When the theft was discovered, he made sure evidence pointed to several of his enemies at court. In the resulting investigation and purge, Harald and a select group of loyal Varangians slipped out of Constantinople on a ship he'd prepared months earlier. By the time the new emperors, Zoe and Theodora, realized what had happened, Harald was already beyond their reach, sailing north toward home with enough wealth to fund a small war. The journey back to Norway took nearly a year. Harald stopped first in Kiev, where Grand Prince Yaroslav received him with the warmth of a man greeting an old friend who had exceeded all expectations. "I hear you became quite the Byzantine general," Yaroslav said, over a feast Harald hosted using Byzantine gold. "I hear you burned down half of Bulgaria and made the emperors tremble." "The stories grow in the telling," Harald replied, though his smile acknowledged the essential truth. "But I learned what I set out to learn. Now I'm going home to claim what's mine." "And what's that?" "Everything." Yaroslav laughed and raised his cup. "Then you'll need allies. I have a proposal. Marry my daughter Elisif. She's of age now, clever as a serpent, and the alliance would give you legitimacy. A Byzantine warrior prince is impressive, but a Byzantine warrior prince married to a roof princess with ties to Sweden becomes a figure kings must take seriously." Harald considered. He had no particular desire for marriage, but Yaroslav was right. The political advantages were undeniable, and Elisif, when he met her, proved to be a sharp-eyed woman who understood exactly what the marriage meant. "I won't pretend to love you," she said frankly during their private meeting, "but I'll be a good wife, a good queen if you achieve your ambitions, and I'll bear you heirs who'll be strong and clever. That's the bargain." "That's more honesty than most marriages begin with," Harald replied. "I accept." They wed in the spring of 1043, with Yaroslav's blessing and a dowry that included gold, weapons, and most valuable of all, the promise of Rus' support should Harald need it. Harald arrived in Norway in the summer of 1045, bringing with him a small army of warriors, enough wealth to buy loyalty, and a reputation that preceded him like thunder. King Magnus, Harald's nephew, and the son of Saint Olaf, as his martyred brother was now known, received him with the mixture of wariness and relief. Magnus had his own problems. He had inherited not only Norway but also Denmark after the death of King Harthacnut, but holding both kingdoms was proving difficult. Danish nobles resented Norwegian rule, Magnus's treasury was strained, and enemies circled like wolves. "Uncle," he greeted him formally at a meeting in Nidaros, the northern capital. He was a young man in his early 20s, handsome and capable, but clearly exhausted by the burdens of ruling. "You've been away a long time." "I've been learning, and now I'm home to help you hold what's yours. Or to take it from me." Harald's smile was sharp. "I'd serve him, for a time, until I understand the situation, and then," he shrugged, "then we'll see what opportunities present themselves." Magnus studied him for a long moment. Harald could see the calculations happening behind his nephew's eyes, weighing the threat Harald represented against the undeniable value of his wealth, experience, and military skill. Co-king. Equal in authority? In Norway, yes. Denmark remains yours until you have it fully pacified, then we'll discuss terms. It was a bold demand, essentially asking for half a kingdom without having fought for it. But Magnus was pragmatic enough to recognize that half a kingdom he could hold was better than a whole kingdom he might lose. They clasped hands, and Norway had 2 kings.
The arrangement worked surprisingly well. Magnus and Harald complemented each other. Magnus handled the diplomatic and administrative aspects of ruling, while Harald focused on military matters and expanding the kingdom's wealth through improved trade. Together, they crushed a rebellion in the uplands, raided the Danish coast to cow rebellious nobles, and restored order to the northern regions. But the partnership was always destined to be temporary. Magnus died suddenly in 1047, possibly of illness, possibly of poison, the sources disagree, leaving Harald as the sole king of Norway. Harald's coronation took place in Nidaros, in the wooden cathedral built over St. Olaf's tomb. He wore armor rather than ceremonial robes, and his crown was a simple circlet of Nordic silver rather than the jeweled Byzantine diadems he'd seen in Constantinople. "I am king by right of blood and by right of strength," he announced to the assembled nobles and warriors. "I have fought in 3 empires, commanded the emperor's guard, and brought Byzantine gold to fill our coffers. Those who serve me loyally will grow rich and powerful. Those who oppose me will learn why the Greeks called me the Thunderbolt." It was a declaration that set the tone for his reign. Harald ruled Norway with an iron fist, brooking no rebellion, crushing any noble who showed signs of disloyalty. He used his Byzantine wealth to hire warriors, build a proper fleet, and establish Norway as a power to be reckoned with. But domestic rule wasn't enough. Harald's ambitions reached beyond Norway's shores. Denmark remained a constant problem. After Magnus's death, Svein Estridsson had claimed the Danish throne, arguing that his bloodline gave him better claim than the Norwegian kings. Harald rejected this utterly and launched a series of campaigns to subdue Denmark by force. For nearly 2 decades, Norway and Denmark were locked in bitter warfare. Harald would invade, burning Danish towns and defeating Danish armies, but he could never hold the territory. Svein would retreat, rebuild, and return. It was a war of attrition that neither side could truly win, a running sore that drained both kingdoms.
"Why do you keep at it?" Elisive asked him after one particularly frustrating campaign in 1060. They had 3 daughters by then, and she had proven to be exactly what she'd promised: a capable queen, a shrewd advisor, and a woman who understood him better than he sometimes liked. Pride and ambition, those are your real enemies, husband. Not Svein, not Denmark, your own refusal to accept anything less than total victory. She was right, of course, but Harald had spent his entire life refusing to accept limitations, and he wasn't about to start now.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
By 1066, Harald was 50 years old, scarred and weathered by decades of warfare, but still formidable. His hair and beard had gone gray. His face was a map of old wounds, and he moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had been abused by years of combat. But his mind remained sharp, his ambition undiminished. The news from England came in the spring. King Edward the Confessor had died without an heir, and Harald Godwinson had seized the throne. Several other claimants emerged almost immediately. William of Normandy, based on some dubious promise Edward had allegedly made. Edgar the Atherling, last of the old royal line, and Harald Hardrada himself, based on an even more dubious agreement between Magnus and Harthacnut years earlier. Harald had no real legal claim to England. He knew it, his advisors knew it, everyone knew it. But legal claims mattered less than power, and Harald had spent 30 years building the power to take what he wanted. "England," he said to Elisive, rolling out a map of the British Isles on their table. "Rich, poorly defended, in chaos from the succession crisis. If I move quickly, I can take it before William of Normandy gathers his forces. You've been fighting Sweyn for 20 years. You've never managed to hold Denmark, which is right next door. What makes you think you can hold England, which is across the sea?" "Denmark doesn't want to be held. The nobles there have their own power, their own ambitions. But England is different. Whoever controls the throne controls the kingdom. Take London, take the crown, and the rest follows." She studied the map, then studied him. "This isn't about England, is it? This is about proving something. About showing the world that Harald Hardrada can achieve what no one else can." He didn't deny it. How could he? Everything he'd done since Stiklestad had been driven by the need to prove he was more than a defeated boy running through the snow. He'd proven it in Kiev, proven it in Constantinople, proven it in Norway. Now he would prove it one final time. Harald's plan required allies, and he found one in an unexpected place: Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the English king. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria until a rebellion drove him out in 1065, and he burned with the particular fury of a man who believed he'd been betrayed by his own family when Harald chose political expediency over brotherly loyalty. They met in Norway in early summer, and Harald found Tostig to be a useful tool. Bitter, desperate, and willing to provide detailed intelligence about English defenses in exchange for promises of restoration and power. "My brother has perhaps 7,000 trained warriors," he explained, sketching out the English military situation. "The Fyrd, the local militia, can provide many more, but they're poorly trained and poorly equipped. If you strike fast, before he can gather his full strength, you can win." "And the other claimants, this William of Normandy?" "Still gathering his invasion fleet.
The winds haven't been favorable for crossing the channel. If you land in the north and move quickly, you'll force Harold to meet you before William can intervene. And if Harold defeats you, he'll be weakened when William arrives. Either way, you're helping destroy my brother's chances." Harold appreciated the cold calculation. Tostig might be motivated by revenge, but he understood strategy. "And if I win, what do you want?" "Northumbria restored to me, recognition as my chief ally in England. That's all." It was a reasonable request, and Harold agreed. Together, they began planning the invasion. Harold spent the summer of 1066 gathering the largest fleet Norway had seen in generations. Over 300 ships assembled in Norwegian harbors, long ships for speed and flexibility, knarrs for carrying supplies and horses, even a few massive drekkers that could hold 60 warriors each. He called in favors, promised plunder, and used his considerable wealth to hire the best warriors from across Scandinavia. By August, he commanded perhaps 10,000 men, a massive force by the standards of the era. Elisiv came to see him off when the fleet prepared to sail. She was in her 50s now, still beautiful in the way of women who have weathered time with dignity. Her daughters stood with her, grown women themselves, watching their father prepare for what everyone understood might be his last campaign. "Come back," she said simply. "I know you won't promise victory, and I won't ask for it. Just promise me you'll come back." He kissed her forehead, a gesture of surprising tenderness from a man not known for softness. "I've survived everything the world has thrown at me. I'll survive this too." But he couldn't quite meet her eyes when he said it. The fleet sailed in late August, catching favorable winds that pushed them south toward England. Harold stood at the prow of his flagship, a massive 60-oared dragon ship called the Serpent, and felt something like peace. Whatever happened next, he would meet it as he'd met everything else in his life, with steel in his hand and fire in his heart. They made landfall in the Humber estuary in early September, the ships beaching on English soil like a swarm of predatory insects. Harold's scouts reported that the local defenses were minimal. Harold Godwinson was in the south, watching for William's invasion, and had left the north only lightly garrisoned. It was exactly the opening Harold had hoped for. They marched on York, the great northern city, pillaging as they went. Harold had learned from his Byzantine campaigns that terror was a weapon like any other. Burn enough villages, kill enough people quickly, and the rest might surrender without fighting. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, gathered their forces and met Harold at Fulford, just south of York. It was September 20th, 1066, and the battle began in mid-morning as the English shield wall formed across the road leading to the city. Harold had fought dozens of battles, maybe hundreds if you count every skirmish and border raid. He knew immediately that this was going to be hard. The English were well positioned, their warriors were seasoned, and they outnumbered his forces slightly. "Standard Viking tactics won't work here," he told his commanders as they surveyed the field. "They're expecting us to charge straight into their shield wall. Instead, we're going to use what the Byzantines taught me." He divided his forces into 3 sections, a center that would engage the English directly, and 2 wings that would sweep around the flanks. It was textbook Byzantine tactics, adapted for Nordic warriors, and it worked brilliantly. The Battle of Fulford lasted 6 hours and ended in complete Norwegian victory. Edwin and Morcar's forces broke and fled, leaving Harold in control of York and the entire north of England. The city surrendered without further resistance, providing hostages and supplies for the Norwegian army. Harald should have been ecstatic. Instead, he felt a strange unease. The victory had come too easily. Where was Harald Godwinson? Why hadn't the English king responded to the invasion? The answer came a week later. Harald had withdrawn his forces from York to Stamford Bridge, a small crossing 8 miles to the east where he'd arranged to receive additional hostages from surrounding areas. It was September 25th, and the day was unseasonably hot.
Harald had allowed his men to leave much of their armor on the ships. The heat was oppressive, and they'd been marching for days. Perhaps a third of his force remained with the fleet at recall, leaving Harald with maybe 7,000 warriors at Stamford Bridge. The first sign of trouble was dust on the horizon, a massive cloud that spoke of an army on the march. "It's Harald," Tostig said, his face draining of color. "It has to be, but how? How did he get here so fast?" Harald felt a chill despite the heat. He'd underestimated his opponent, committed the cardinal sin of assuming his enemy would react slowly. Harald Godwinson had force-marched his army nearly 200 miles in less than 5 days, an incredible feat of logistics and endurance. And now he was here with a fresh army while Harald's forces were scattered and under-armored. "Form up," Harald commanded, his voice steady despite the ice in his gut. "Shield wall, standard formation, send runners to the ships, we need reinforcements." But he knew with cold certainty that the reinforcements would arrive too late. The English army appeared like an avenging tempest, perhaps 8,000 strong, their shields bright with fresh paint, their dragon banner snapping in the wind. At their head rode Harald Godwinson himself, a man Harald had never met, but immediately recognized. There was a quality to the way the English king sat his horse, a combination of confidence and fury that marked him as dangerous. A group of English riders approached under a peace banner. Harald rode out to meet them with Tostig at his side. "Toasted Godwinson, King Harald offers you peace, pardon, and restoration to your earldom if you abandon this Norse adventurer and return to your allegiance." Tostig's face showed his struggle. For a moment, Harald wondered if his ally would actually take the offer. Then Tostig straightened in his saddle. "And what does my brother offer to King Harald of Norway?" 7 feet of English ground," the rider replied flatly, "or more, since he's taller than most men." Harald laughed, despite everything. It was a good line, the kind of thing he might have said himself. "Tell your king he fights well, and his offer is declined. We'll see who earns their 7 feet of ground." The rider wheeled his horse and galloped back to the English lines.
The Battle of Stamford Bridge began in chaos as Harald's scattered forces tried to form a cohesive line. The English came on like a wave, crashing into the Norwegian positions with practiced discipline. Harald fought in the front rank, as he always had, his sword, the same blade Yaroslav had given him 36 years earlier, still sharp, still deadly. Around him, his warriors fought with the desperation of men who knew they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The legendary discipline of the Varangian Guard combined with Nordic ferocity made them dangerous even in a losing situation, and the battle quickly devolved into a grinding, brutal struggle. Harald found himself face to face with an English housecarl, a professional warrior whose skill matched his own. Their weapons met and scraped, shields crashed together, and for a moment the entire war narrowed to just the two of them. Harald feinted high, struck blow, and his blade found the gap between the housecarl's leg armor. The man fell, and Harald stepped over him, moving deeper into the fighting. He was 50 years old, fighting in heat that would have felled younger men, wearing armor that felt like it weighed twice what it had in his youth. But habit and skill kept him alive, kept his blade moving, kept his shield up. For an hour, maybe 2, it seemed like the Norwegians might hold.
Harald rallied his men again and again, his voice cutting through the din of battle, his presence worth 100 warriors. The English were taking heavy casualties, their advance stalling against the desperate Norwegian defense. Then everything changed. No one is entirely sure what happened next. The sagas and chronicles disagree on the details, but they all agree on the result. Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, veteran of 100 battles, the last great Viking warrior, was struck in the throat by an arrow. Some accounts say it was a lucky shot from a random archer. Others claim an English marksman specifically targeted the tall, gray-bearded warrior who was clearly commanding the Norwegian forces. It doesn't matter. The arrow flew, Harald's hand went to his throat, and he fell. Tostig tried to rally the Norwegians, tried to hold the line, but the heart had gone out of the army. Within minutes, the shield wall was breaking. Within an hour, the Norwegians were in full retreat, running for the ships at Rickel with the English in pursuit. Harald lay where he had fallen, his blood soaking into English soil. Around him, the battle raged on, but he no longer heard it. His last thoughts, if the chroniclers can be believed, were of Norway, of the white peaks and dark fjords that he would never see again. He had come to England seeking one last crown, one final victory to cement his legend. Instead, he found the end all warriors eventually meet, sudden, random, and utterly final. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a catastrophic defeat for the Norwegian invasion. Of the 10,000 warriors who had landed in England, perhaps 3,000 survived to sail home. Tostig died in the fighting, along with most of Harald's senior commanders. The survivors, led by Harald's son Olaf, whom Harald had brought on the campaign, were allowed to leave after swearing never to return. The battle also marked the effective end of the Viking Age. Never again would Norse warriors launch major invasions of European kingdoms. The era of longships and raiding was over, replaced by a new order of feudal knights and stone castles. For Harald Godwinson, the victory at Stamford Bridge was both triumph and tragedy. He had destroyed Harald Hardrada's army in one of the most decisive battles in English history. But the effort had cost him dearly. His forces were exhausted, his supplies depleted, and he'd been forced to leave the south undefended, which was exactly when William of Normandy finally launched his invasion. Harold force-marched his battered army south, fighting and defeating William at Hastings just 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge. But this time, it was Harold who fell with an arrow in his eye, according to tradition, and William who claimed the crown. 3 kings had fought for England in 1066. All 3 were magnificent warriors, brilliant commanders, and ruthlessly ambitious. But only one, William, survived to build a kingdom that would last centuries. Harald Hardrada's body was returned to Norway and buried in Nidaros, not far from his half-brother Saint Olaf. The saga poets who loved a tragic hero made him the subject of countless verses. He became a symbol of an era, the last gasp of Viking glory before the world changed into something new. But Harald's real legacy was more complex than the poets suggested. He had been a bridge between worlds, a Viking who learned Byzantine sophistication, a Nordic warrior who understood imperial politics, a pagan-born king who ruled a Christian kingdom. He represented the transition from the early medieval chaos of raiding and tribute to the more structured world of territorial kingdoms and diplomatic alliances. In Norway, he was remembered as a strong king who had brought order and prosperity, even if his foreign wars had sometimes drained the kingdom's resources. His legal reforms, his promotion of trade, and his establishment of a more centralized royal authority all survived his death and shaped Norway for generations. In Byzantium, where he'd spent 12 years, he was remembered as one of the greatest Varangian commanders, a warrior whose tactical brilliance and personal courage had saved the empire in several critical battles. The Guard itself would continue for another 400 years, always remembering Harald Hardrada as one of their own. And in England, ironically, his invasion had profound consequences he never lived to see. By forcing Harold Godwinson to fight 2 massive battles in 3 weeks, Harold had weakened the English forces just enough to give William of Normandy his chance. The Norman conquest, which would transform England utterly, might never have succeeded without Harold's ill-fated invasion. Elisif lived for another 20 years after her husband's death, ruling as regent for their grandson until he came of age. She never remarried. When asked about Harold, she would smile sadly and say, "He was a difficult man to love, but impossible not to respect." He spent his life trying to prove he was worthy of being remembered, never realizing that men like him are impossible to forget. History tends to judge Harald Hardrada harshly for his final campaign. The invasion of England is seen as a miscalculation, an overreach driven by ego and ambition. Modern historians point out that he had no real claim to the English throne, that the invasion was poorly planned, that his death accomplished nothing except to open the door for Norman conquest. All of this is true, but it misses something essential about who Harold was and what he represented. Harald Hardrada was born in an age of transitions, when the old certainties were crumbling and new orders were emerging. He survived the death of his king and brother, survived exile and warfare, survived the Byzantine courts, Byzantine politics. He made himself into one of the most formidable warriors of his age, not through noble birth alone, but through sheer determination and the refusal to accept defeat. Was he cruel? Undoubtedly. The campaigns in Bulgaria, the burning of Danish villages, the ruthless suppression of Norwegian rebels, these were not the actions of a merciful man. Was he ambitious to the point of recklessness? The invasion of England makes that clear. Was he difficult, demanding, impossible to live with unless you matched his intensity? Just ask Elisif. But he was also capable of inspiring tremendous loyalty. The warriors who followed him from Norway to England did so knowing the odds were poor. They followed him because he was Harald Hardrada, because he'd led them to victory before, because his reputation was such that even a doomed campaign seemed like it might somehow succeed if he was in command.
And in his own way, he was honorable. He kept his word to his allies, rewarded loyalty, and faced his enemies directly. He didn't scheme and plot like a Byzantine courtier. When Harald Hardrada wanted something, he took it by force, or he didn't take it at all. Perhaps the best measure of Harald's life came from an unexpected source. Years after his death, a Byzantine chronicler who had known him during his Varangian Guard days wrote, "Harald the Norwegian was a man born out of his time. He had the heart of a Viking and the mind of an emperor, and he could never quite reconcile the two. If he had been born a century earlier, he would have been another Canute, building a northern empire. If he had been born a century later, he might have learned to be satisfied with what he had. But he lived in the twilight between ages, and men like that are doomed to reach for glory even when glory is impossible." On the field at Stamford Bridge, as Harald lay dying with an arrow in his throat, did he have any final thoughts about the meaning of his life? Did he regret the invasion, the ambition that had brought him to this end? We can't know. The chronicles and sagas are silent on his final moments, but perhaps it's fitting that we don't know. Harald Hardrada spent his entire life defying expectations, refusing to be confined by limitations, reaching always for something more. In the end, he died as he had lived, fighting against impossible odds, leading from the front, refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain. For a warrior of his generation and culture, there was no better death.
The last great Viking fell on English soil in the warm September sun of 1066, and with him fell an entire age. The world that produced men like Harald, the world of long ships and raiding, of pagan gods and warrior kings who carved their thrones from conquered lands, was already fading. Within a few generations, it would be gone entirely, replaced by the feudal order of knights and castles, of courtly love and chivalric codes. Harald Hardrada stood at that threshold, one foot in each world, belonging fully to neither. And perhaps that's his real legacy. Not the battles he won or the kingdoms he almost conquered, but the way he embodied a moment of historical transition, when one era was dying and another being born. The Vikings called such men berserkers, warriors who fought with such fury that they seemed possessed by the old gods. But Harald was more than that. He was the last berserker who learned to read, the last raider who understood economics, the last pagan who ruled a Christian kingdom. He was, in the end, exactly what he claimed to be, Harald Hardrada, the hard ruler, the man who would rather break than bend, who would rather die reaching for glory than live accepting less. And on that September day in 1066, when the arrow found his throat and he fell, the thunder of the Viking Age finally died with him.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.